Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. This is Andrew, and I am so excited with the guest that I am joined in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I am here with Dr. Alex Ketchum. I'm going to introduce Alex to you all. Alex is the faculty lecturer of the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies of McGill University. She is the director of the Just Feminist Tech and Scholarship Lab. Her work integrates food, environmental, technological, and gender history. We're going to get into all of that. She also has two recent books out that I can't wait to talk to her about. One of them is called Engage in Public Scholarship, a guidebook on feminist and accessible communication from 2022. And the other is her most recent one, Ingredients for Revolution, a history of American feminist restaurants, cafes, and coffee houses. And she also has a new book coming out that is called Recoding Feminisms. So I know she delves into AI and feminist ethics about artificial intelligence. So, without further ado, here is Dr. Ketchum. Hi, Alex.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited for our conversation today.
Yeah, I was so excited that you reached out after our queer history conference experience, which there's been so many who have joined me here from that conference. Um, so yeah, thank you for being part of this extended conversation from the Queer History Conference.
Definitely. As we were talking about a little bit before the recording, it was such a positive experience. It was wonderful. If folks have the opportunity to go in the future, I highly recommend it because there's just a more relaxed kind of vibe at the conference. It brings together established academics, some of the leaders in the field. It has early career scholars, it has graduate students, it even had undergraduate students, it has people working in public schools and community colleges, and people in archives and libraries all coming together and sharing ideas around queer history. And there's not that kind of hierarchy that you see at other conferences. People were eating lunch together, sharing ideas, and really mentoring each other. So it was a really lovely environment to work in and celebrate the amazing queer history work that's being done.
Yeah, I mean, you've summed it up so nicely. And what excited me is the independent scholarly focus and that public that in order to understand LGBTQ plus and feminist concerns, it can't come just from the ivory tower. It can't just be an academic discourse. We need to understand what's happening in the public sphere and that those public people were represented and that academics were actually applauding them is
Exactly.
so rare in a conference space. I mean, I think it's changing. Well, let's start there because you have published such recent work in your feminist scholarly conversations in I mean, can you remind everyone again, when did you receive your PhD, Alex?
I finished in 2018. So it was a PhD in history from McGill University with a lot of kind of gender studies, feminist studies stuff, because my master's was a double in history and gender studies.
So, okay, you're a recent PhD, so
Yeah.
you're part of the same vein I am, which is being aware of this intersectionality of communication that social media. I mean, I know Alex has a Twitter, has an Instagram, find them in the show notes. I here we have a TikTok, an Instagram, a Twitter. I'm so public with my Instagram, but a lot of academics are behind privacy on social media. And I think
Mhm.
what do you think about that? Do you think it's because they haven't really, it's a generational gap or they're very nervous about privacy, like to understand how they can brand themselves?
Yeah, I think there's a few aspects of why people will be private or public with their social media accounts. I think for some of it, it has to do with the labor conditions you're working in. So some folks are really worried about misspeaking or misrepresenting their work or their institutions. And if they're in a position where they have a lot of stability at their workplace, they don't want to jeopardize that. So I'm thinking of long tenured professors or even people that might be going up for tenure soon, right? There's a little bit more of a risk for maybe misspeaking on a social media platform. For a lot of earlier career scholars, many of us are aware that there's basically not many stable jobs out there, and that sometimes the only way that we'll actually be able to share our scholarship is on these different social media platforms or other forms of public work. The other reason some scholars go private or private for certain amounts of time, and this is something I talk about in my book, Engage in Public Scholarship, is there is a risk of being trolled or doxxed, especially for women, people of color, LGBTQ people, people who exist at multiple identities within the groups I mentioned, right? Marginalized scholars or folks who are working on certain kinds of topics dealing with racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, you're more likely to be trolled or doxxed. And so there's also sometimes safety concerns that people have, which are legitimate because our institutions often don't have strategies in place, protocols in place to support us when that happens. So I really encourage people to do public aspects of their work and share what we're doing outside of the ivory tower. I think it's really important, especially as many of us are at taxpayer-funded institutions or our grants are taxpayer-funded, right? We want to share this work. We want people to actually be able to use all that amazing stuff that we've created. But at the same time, people have to navigate different safety concerns. So I think there's a lot of dynamics to this. And then also it requires different kinds of skill sets. And I know people can be very dismissive of social media work or other forms of kind of public scholarship like podcasting and stuff, but like you actually need to learn how to use these tools, right? Making a podcast, you're going to have to learn recording software, how to interview people. And yes, you can teach yourself those things just the way you taught yourself through your comprehensive exams and writing a dissertation and stuff like that. But, there is an investment of time that's necessary.
Yeah, well, and you also have to learn marketing strategies for a
Mm-hmm.
podcast. I mean,
Yeah.
as this is coming out and premiering, it's been almost 3 years of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room, and I've had to teach. I had a background in marketing from high school and my parents who were in the business field, but I also have a performing background. I love that extroverted sense of these conversations. I've received a lot of negative comments from anonymous social media accounts. They're always anonymous, or they're always people you can't really trace. Um, but again, if I'm putting out a controversial topic, something that I'm really invested in, like, what we're coming out with today, there's going to be all different aspects of feminism we're about to get into in the
Mm-hmm.
West, in the US, I mean, you're in Canada, but I know Alex told me she's from Southern California.
Yep.
Spoiler alert. Um, but I expect if I put out a certain topic, there's going to be different sides. And I'm fine with that because that's what I signed up for. But
Mm-hmm.
um, from my conversation with Ben with his Bad Gays podcast and his book, he said, some academics are really suited for public scholarly activist voices. Not everyone should have to feel they need to go into that. Like if they feel that they're better suited for more of the anonymous, like them just having their profile at their university, there should be
Mm-hmm.
space for that. But like you've said, is there space for that? I mean, can you really still be the quote unquote traditional academic who publishes and just teaches at your university without the public knowing who you are?
Yeah, I think it depends on your field. I think it depends on your research topic. Some topics are easier to communicate about, right? I think that's one of the benefits of being a historian is we tell stories. And so even if people don't have as much of a background in the material, I can usually include people in my work in different components of it. Whereas for some of my friends who are molecular biologists, it's a little harder to connect. But I don't think that it always has to be that you have this big public profile to share your research and work with others. Sometimes it could just be a blog post or a zine or just another way to share some of it, right? It doesn't have to be that your face is on it. It doesn't have to link to personal account, right? I think there's ways that we can have different levels of safety and privacy while also doing public work if that's a concern for you. I know some people don't like having their picture taken, but you can have an avatar, right? Chris Gilliard does amazing work around surveillance and educational technology. And he does a lot of public events, but he always uses an avatar, right? So that's a way that he is mitigating some of these safety concerns. And also in his use of avatar, it allows him to bring listeners and people who are in the audience into this space of thinking about, okay, well, what does it mean to have my face in these places, which is part of his research, right? So I think there's different strategies.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And like these are tools that others out there can absorb and use. But what I am so eager to discuss, I mean, everything we've just discussed has been fascinating, but your two recent books um, have really, and everyone, I know Alex on her website has a discount code. So, go over to her website in our show notes. And your two books, especially, I really want to discuss what you had done with Engage in Public Scholarship first,
Okay.
because um, you really looked into the power dynamics behind feminist concerns. I mean, I know you're really invested in digital spaces, but like this will definitely speak to what I think is the crux of a lot of conversations right now, which is there seems to be, I don't want to say a divide, because I don't think it's a divide necessarily. Like maybe that's where you can lambast this or question it, I should say. Lambast sounds as if you're a feminist satirist. Um, but there is a real broad conversation about feminism, quote unquote. Say Paris Hilton's new memoir. I mean, I know you sent me. I'm thinking of that because I'm listening to her audiobook. But Emily Ratajkowski and her book. There's Lean In, which I know you sent my way. Um, I had talked about the trouble with white women and the right with white women. That's one book that I have had an engagement with by Kyla Schuler. But all of that's to say is there's a lot being published right now, especially in the memoir space, with well-known women and their stories. Or even, do you know the YouTube channel Jubilee?
I don't know if I know it. Like, there's a few things called Jubilee, but I'm thinking of more of like celebration of like women in the culinary space Jubilee. So I don't know if
Okay,
that's the
no,
one
no.
you're referencing.
It's
Okay.
a digital media space where they do a lot of um middle ground conversations. Like they'll
Hmm.
bring people who are pro-feminism and anti-feminism and have
Okay.
them talk it out in a roundtable setting.
Okay.
So, I mean, I think it's fascinating if you are interested in feminist um, issues to hear how the different generations are discussing it from the public. But do you feel that feminism, especially when you were doing your work and trying to find that engaging language, there is a disconnect between what is published or what the public conversation is? Like, say, take a Paris Hilton or take Lean In compared to what's published behind peer-reviewed articles and paywall material.
Yeah, for sure. So, to begin, there's a lot of different types of feminism, and feminism is a really debated term. So, for folks listening who are maybe less aware, there's Marxist feminism, socialist feminism, anarchist feminism, liberal feminism, radical feminism. There's a lot of debates between people who identify within those categories. There's trans inclusive feminism, which I think, to be a feminist, trans inclusion is really important. There's anti-racist feminism, anti-carceral feminism, and so whether it's public work or if it's scholarly work, there's these different versions of feminism represented. So you sometimes see this kind of white stream, which is like kind of white mainstream feminism that is in many ways a kind of liberal feminism that purports that, if a few women get to a place of power, I sometimes call it trickle down feminism. There's this sense that we'll have more social justice and sexism will be eradicated if we have a few like women CEOs and like women political leaders. I'm not saying it's not important to have women in positions of power, But that's a kind of limited version of seeing how power works in society. But it's something that a lot of times the media latches onto, and it's often a discourse that's dominated by white women, whether it's in academia or outside of academia. So that's oftentimes this kind of sense of like a girl boss feminism, also, right? Like it's this understanding that maybe you can make it to the top in our capitalist society. But there's a lot of feminisms that say, like, look, we can't even have a socially just world under capitalism. And we actually have to challenge a lot of the social structures themselves. It's not about winning this race, but making it better for everybody. And that means that you have to address racism, you have to address homophobia, you have to address classism. And all these different components. And so there's amazing work that's happening outside the academy that is done from social justice networks, that's grassroots feminism, that's oftentimes led by women of color, by Black feminists, by people who are thinking about big questions around economic structures, carceral structures, are really paying attention to the needs of sex workers, are paying attention to the needs of people of all different gender identities. So there's amazing radical work that is happening. And I'm saying radical in terms of like overturning some of the challenges in society, not just radical feminism. In the academy, we also see a lot of different types of feminism represented. So there can be critiques of a lot of academic work, peer-reviewed articles that are really thinking of feminism in a limited way that is still really focused on the needs of like white middle class and upper middle class women. This has been a critique of certain feminist academic work basically since the 1970s, when it starts to get published more and more in academia. But you also have amazing scholars who are doing feminist work, who are published in amazing journals, who are publishing books that are thinking about the ways that power works, that oppression works, are thinking about these questions again of racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all being intertwined and working in different ways, right? So we oftentimes hear the word intersectionality coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a legal scholar in 1989, and that's kind of served as this basis for a lot of feminist work today. And so there's intersectional work inside and outside the academy, and there's non-intersectional work inside and outside the academy. So I don't think it's like that academic feminism is more intersectional or work outside of the academy is more intersectional. I think we see these divisions throughout, but what we oftentimes see most represented in popular culture and media and book sales that can sell a lot is that kind of white mainstream girl boss feminism. Because it's not challenging to capitalist structures, and oftentimes it's celebrity memoirs who are reflecting that kind of feminism in their own lives.
Yeah, thank you for laying out all the branches of feminism because I've actually, surprisingly, I didn't know I would be using Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon's anti-porn conversation, but I have in my dissertation, which when you're listening to this, I'm either about to defend my dissertation or have defended, but I think I'm about to defend my dissertation when this comes out. It's in July. So I think this
Nice.
is going to be like one of the last episodes before we go on a break for a little while. Um, but their anti-porn conversations, the reason I bring that up is, I mean, Catherine McKinnon has gone further beyond that, but their 1970s type work into the 80s. Um, what's interesting is there's a new book coming out called The Pornography Wars,
Mm-hmm.
which I can't wait to get my hands on. Hopefully, I can interview that scholar. But I approach it more from a homoerotic pornography lens. And I always felt that anti-porn feminist scholars, quote unquote, again, I'm
Mm-hmm.
speaking I in a broad stroke here. I mean, I have a grad certificate in women's gender sexuality studies, Alex. So I don't want to be accused of like not highlighting everything, but that's what happens with a public conversation is
For
we
sure.
have to paint a certain picture for the listeners who are not all academics, which I love. Thank you for listening. You all are artists in your own way. And I thought that they always were so laser focused on the straight male image and a straight female image, but when it came to queer bodies, especially queer male bodies, that was never part of the fabric. Like that's never really discussed about how empowering it is for queer male bodies to see pornography because they don't feel represented. So like I'm using that more as my debate with
Mhm.
them. But there's been a lot done in gay porn studies. So, you
Yeah,
know,
for sure.
and I have some of them on the podcast soon. But no, go ahead, Alex.
Oh, I was
Yeah.
just going to say, and yeah, and I mean, in addition to, I am not aware of this new book coming out about the pornography wars, but there's also, right, it's kind of encapsulated oftentimes as the sex wars and debates within different feminist groups in that time period about what does sex work mean, right? It was really important, the coining of the term sex work to recognize it as work, but that itself was also contested. For folks who end up looking into kind of feminist history, one of the things that you see throughout is that debate is ongoing, and there's not always agreement in how to create a more socially just world without patriarchy, right? And so, what's interesting too in my research is because I look at people who called themselves feminist and called their businesses feminist in my feminist restaurant book because I didn't want to be prescriptive in ideas of what is feminism because it's so debated. I have my own definitions and I say it in my work of like what I'm thinking of, but I'm interested in studying people who are invested in situating their work and their projects and themselves within feminism and how they try to embody that because it is so debated.
Well, and I feel that when you're talking, what I love about your book on feminist restaurants and coffee cafes and you know, these spaces is that a lot of them that I now see in existence, like that I would see as having that, they had that feminist um, vision have also become such inclusive LGBTQ plus spaces. Like I'm thinking of even
Mm-hmm.
Pen and Brush, who we work with here, who is started as a female artist space in the late 1800s in Manhattan to promote female artists, but now has also become a women empowered and LGBTQ plus empowered space.
Mm-hmm.
Or Blue Stockings bookstore in Manhattan. I'm thinking a lot of the bookstores because I know more of their history.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Housing Works, which was started with um, helping the LGBTQ plus community with HIV and AIDS.
Mm-hmm.
And there's even a feminist cafe here on Long Island called Tiger Lily that is also very inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community. So, like, is that something you just started to see? Is there's been this expansive view of what it means to be a
Yeah,
feminist space? Yeah.
I mean, like even in the 1970s. So my book Ingredients for Revolution looks from 1972 to 2022, that kind of 50-year period. And most of, not all of them, but most of them were started by lesbian feminists, or people who maybe later used the title like queer feminists. But at the time, we're usually using lesbian, some in terms of there's identities for their sexual orientation, and some in this kind of 1970s political lesbianism, which is an identity we don't see as much today, but is this understanding of lesbian identity as choosing to be a lesbian in a way to enact your feminist values. So there's this phrase at the time, feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice. Now, this isn't the way that all feminists saw feminism in the 1970s. You also had very homophobic, anti-lesbian feminists who would call lesbians the lavender menace to the feminist movement. But there was a large investment by lesbians and women who today sometimes identify as queer, like when you interview them later, on in creating women-centered space, lesbian-centered space, but using the word feminism to kind of speak to that. And in the 70s and 80s, there is a lot of kind of overlap with lesbian periodicals, feminist periodicals speaking to all these movements. Now, chapter 8 of my book speaks about spaces kind of in the 2000s and onward. And so we see shifts generationally between who's starting these spaces. So in the 70s and 80s, the restaurants and cafes tended to be founded more by white lesbians, many of whom were Jewish, but not exclusively so, from like middle class backgrounds, but again, not exclusively so, because those were groups that prior to the passage of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act So that was in 1974. So women couldn't get credit in their own name. So it was already really hard to get money to start a business as a woman and then as a lesbian. So if you're also adding racism on top of that, it's just become such a huge barrier. But now we see a lot of queer feminist spaces being founded by women of color, Black women, Latino women, and they tend to be really explicitly trans inclusive. So there were trans inclusive spaces that I look at in the 70s and 80s, but now, and there were trans exclusive ones too. That's a like sad part of that history. But if you look at ones today, they tend to be way more trans inclusive. They tend to be really queer inclusive, and they tend to be founded by a wider diversity of women from different ethnic and racial backgrounds. So there are shifts. There's also shifts in terms of feminism and understandings of gender and understandings of, again, different kinds of intersections of power. But queerness and especially lesbian identity was always a really big part of this history.
Yeah, well, and I think all of the terms you've laid out, because you have explained and expanded so much upon these 1970s, what I love is you really are such an expert, Alex, on the quote unquote waves of feminism, of even critiquing that whole notion that it's not like one wave happens, the other wave happens. I mean, there's been a lot of work done on the second wave doesn't just lead to the third wave. Like, and I don't even know what we're in right now. I mean, I don't even think we operate under a wave system anymore, right? It's not like this is the fourth wave, is it?
Yeah, so I mean, the terms of the waves are oftentimes debated. So there was this kind of push into like the 90s with Rebecca Walker and Naomi. We
Naomi
can't
Wolf.
Wolf. Yes, Naomi Wolf. I was like, is it Campbell Wolf?
No,
Campbell
it's
Wolf. I
okay.
just
It's
was
okay.
like,
And oh,
yes, Naomi Wolf. Yeah.
Rebecca Walker is Alice
Yes.
Walker's
Or
daughter, just for
yes,
everyone out
exactly.
there.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, because there is kind of, but it doesn't really matter who coined it, but then they're kind of talking about the 90s as being the start of this third wave. But there's issues, and then some folks are like, are we in a fourth wave? Are we not in a fourth wave? I actually tend to reject the wave theory in general because, like, as you're pointing to, right, it doesn't actually speak to the intellectual history of how people build ideas. Ideas don't just come out of nowhere. They're always intertwined with other kinds of movements, other thoughts that are happening at the time. But also the wave theory that we oftentimes see, that kind of periodization, really focuses on white middle class and upper middle class women's experiences in the United States. So the waves don't even transfer into other geographic contexts in the same way. And it also erases a lot of important work by like Chicana farm workers in the United States, a lot of the labor movements that happened in the early to mid 20th century. It really kind of erases different kinds of histories because for folks who aren't aware, oftentimes the first wave is seen as ending when the 19th Amendment is passed. Sorry, not the 19th Amendment. Oh my goodness. Yes, the 19th
No,
Amendment.
you're right.
When women, yes, early morning, 19th Amendment is passed and women get the right to vote. But of course, not all women got the right to vote at that time. It was about white women getting the right to vote, right? So there were barriers for Native American Indigenous women to get the right to vote in the United States, for Asian American women to get the right to vote, Black American women, disabled women to get the right to vote, right? So you have all of these different barriers. Also, it's not even people 18, right? It's 21. So it's not all women getting the right to vote. So even that early periodization is really limited to that white center.
Yeah. Well, something that I think you brought, like what you brought us to is so important because it's what's in our culture right now, I think, is the language. Like, we can't talk about public conversation without talking about the jargon. So,
Hmm.
I mean, I love Paris Hilton's memoir. I think it is fascinating, but I also think it's part of a larger conversation. We had on Ebony K. Williams, who wrote Bet on Black and talks about Black feminism and her own view as a legal scholar, as being the first Black Real Housewife of New York. And she has a whole career in media and Fox News and being the only progressive when she was on her channel, not her channel, but on her show. in Fox News. Um, that she was kind of always going up against the tokenism idea of her being a
Mm-hmm.
black woman and how she had to really combat that. Whereas Paris Hilton is pulling the layers back of her trauma. And
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't just the pretty party girl. And there's a lot of depth to Paris Hilton and perhaps um, aspects and skeletons in her family that don't want to come out there, which I think I can say, she doesn't say it, but I'll say here for everyone that the Hiltons have definitely benefited from corporate interest, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm not saying it's a negative because that's part of capitalism, but they also have made deals with, there's a reason why some of them go to Mar-a-Lago. Like, there is a Republican investment, but Paris has opened up in her book about her LGBTQ plus investment of going to clubs and having realized that she doesn't say that she went against her political family's interests, but she's starting to kind of veer into how her parents didn't understand the trauma they put her under when she went to this abusive boarding school, and that she realized the legal system needs to be changed, and she started to go up against um children's rights for any abusive system in schooling. And I don't know, I think it's really interesting, Alex, because like Paris is walking this fine line, which is you can tell she wants to call out the political um conservatism of her family, but she also doesn't because then she puts herself out there to be thrown out in a way, even though she's an adult. So, like, you can tell she's progressive, but she's not using the language. And is that what you mean in a way about like her white um privilege, so to speak? Like, even though she is opening up about trauma, there's also a protectiveness that she's being cast as the first influencer, and there's all of this language about her boss attitude, like she's entering that phase. Hi, this is Dr. Andrew Rimby, the host and director of the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I hope you're enjoying what you're watching on the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. So to watch the rest of the episode, head to our Patreon. It is patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. That's Ivory Tower Boiler Room. And you can watch the rest of the episode on our $5 a month membership called ITBR Student, or join the ITBR Professor membership. It's only $10 a month. You get access to all of our videos. You get access to both of our book clubs, the Ivory Tower Boiler Room and the True Crime and Academia book club. Plus, you unlock all of our other episodes. So at the ITBR Student, you only get access to our weekly interviews and the True Crime and Academia episodes. For $10 a month, you get access to our ITBR rewatches, our Teaches series, and True Crime and Academia rewatches and Teaches series, plus the book clubs. Okay, can't wait to see you all on Patreon. And just a reminder, I also offer consultation services. It is $30 for your initial consultation. You get a 1 hour private Zoom with me, and I will help you whether you want to create your own podcast and or media brand, you want to navigate academia as an undergrad or grad student, you need help with technology as it relates to teaching or media, do you want to expand your social media presence as an artist, writer, podcaster, or academic, or even crafting your public humanities identity, I will help you with my consultation services. You can also find that on Patreon as well. Okay. Thank you all for watching and for supporting the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Bye.